Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a set of highly controversial interlocking theories drawn straight from our source materials. These texts attempt to explain what they call the hidden architecture of global power, economics, and history. Our goal here is to impartially break down exactly what these sources argue is the real structural matrix running our world today.
You turn on the news and it often feels like pure geopolitical chaos, right? Well, the fundamental question these sources pose is this: is the current global world order collapsing by design? The texts argue that what we're seeing isn't an accident. They claim it's actually a controlled demolition orchestrated by ruling elites to transition us into an entirely new system of governance. So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to cover the end of Westphalia, the rise of digital neo-feudalism, the imperial demolition, the architecture of control, rewriting ancient history, and finally, achieving cognitive sovereignty. Let's just dive right in.
Part 1, the end of Westphalia and the massive paradigm shift we are supposedly living through.
The sources present a pretty bold foundational claim here. They argue that the 400-year-old Westphalian system, which is basically the idea of sovereign states, physical borders, and national laws, is terminal. We are actively moving from an old model to a new model where power is fundamentally migrating. In this new world, territory is being replaced by data. You're no longer seen as a citizen. You are just a user. Think about it. The author argues that traditional national law is actively being superseded by proprietary digital platforms and their terms of service, ultimately replacing national sovereignty with algorithmic control.
Which brings us to Part 2, digital neo-feudalism rising, or the new economy.
So, if the old system is dead, what exactly are we entering? The crucial point the source makes here is the rise of something they call techno-feudalism. The author argues this is an economy of extraction that essentially replaces fundamental human rights with terms of service, those incredibly long agreements we all just blindly click accept on. By utilizing AI, vast networks, and biometric data, the texts claim the ultimate goal is to make populations completely predictable and manageable. The author is adamant that this isn't just technological progress, it is a structural coup against humanity.
Moving to Part 3, the imperial demolition, detailing the alleged fall of the U.S. empire. To really understand this structural shift, we've got to look at the macroeconomics forcing it. $1 trillion. To put that into perspective, that is more than the entire gross domestic product of most countries on Earth. But according to the source material, this is the staggering amount the United States spends every single year just to cover the interest on its government bonds. The text frames this massive debt burden as the primary catalyst for what it calls an impending financial supercrisis. The sources neutrally highlight the severe fiscal limits of the traditional imperial model by comparing the U.S. debt burden to countries like Italy, Lebanon, and the Philippines. Right now, interest consumes roughly 14 to 19% of the U.S. budget. The core argument being made here is that the old system, the one relying on global dollar hegemony and endless overseas military bases, has simply run out of money. Now, to manage this retreat, the texts make a highly controversial claim. They argue that conflicts, specifically the war in Ukraine, are actually being used as strategic tools. According to the sources, this conflict serves three primary utilities for global elites: the forced deindustrialization of the European Union, the containment of Eurasian economic integration, and perhaps most surprisingly, serving as a live proving ground for algorithmic warfare. They claim it's being used to test out advanced AI military tech, like Palantir Analytics and autonomous edge compute drones, right on the battlefield.
The sources go a step further and point to specific political figures they claim are acting as the administrative proxies in this whole transition. The texts name figures like Scott Bessent at the Treasury, Marco Rubio at the State Department, and Kevin Warsh at the Federal Reserve. According to the authors, these figures aren't just operating independently. They are specifically tasked by financial and tech elites with managing the shift away from a global empire and toward a closed, heavily controlled domestic technate.
All right, Part 4, the architecture of control and the architects themselves.
Now, this builds into the text's most highly charged claims regarding exactly who is orchestrating this overarching structure. Reading directly from the source material, the author argues that global elites operate as a unified, rational coalition managed by specific networks. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or WASC elites, are described as the public face and military executors. Chinese diaspora networks act as tools of global capital. Arab funds provide financial integration, and techno-oligarchs serve as the, quote, matrix marionettes.
Finally, the texts claim that Jewish financial and informational networks act as the overarching structural layer holding this entire system together. It's important to note that the source insists this is a structural analysis of a unified system, not a conspiracy.
Section 5, Rewriting Ancient History, which the text frames as the ideological battleground.
The source material argues that control isn't just financial or technological, it's also deeply historical. Unpacking a timeline of the Middle East, the source argues against the existence of United Kingdom of Israel in the 10th century BCE, which is the claimed era of Kings David and Solomon. The text asserts that the earliest minor settlements in Jerusalem only appeared later, in the 9th or 8th century BCE, and that the biblical texts detailing these grand empires were actually compiled centuries after that, between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE. The core argument here is that this history is actually a retrospective myth deliberately used to justify modern territorial claims.
To back up this ideological battleground, the text relies heavily on academic perspectives. For example, it highlights viewpoints attributed to archaeologists like Tel Aviv University's Israel Finkelstein, essentially stating Jerusalem of David's time was a small mountain village. The biblical story is a retrospective view from the 7th to 5th centuries BCE. The source uses these claims to neutrally dispute the historical and archaeological existence of a grand ancient Israelite empire, tying it right back to their main overarching theory: whoever controls the historical narrative controls the present.
Finally, Part 6, Achieving Cognitive Sovereignty, or the Defense. After laying out this vast interlocking architecture of control, you might be wondering, well, what's the defense mechanism here? The source's answer to that is cognitive sovereignty. As the text defines it, this is your ability to refuse algorithmic reprogramming, to see through the structural noise, and to maintain your own historical memory. The author frames this as the absolute ultimate tool for personal survival in what they describe as an ongoing biological and informational war against humanity.
So how do you actually achieve that? The text outlines 3 very concrete tactics. First, algorithmic autonomy, basically using independent models to bypass corporate black box algorithms. Second, substrate realism, which means prioritizing hard, tangible physical realities like land and direct energy access way above digital illusions. And third, predictive analysis, learning to filter out the geopolitical smokescreen so you can track where physical assets and capital are actually moving in the real world.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. If the sources we've looked at are correct, and the world is truly shifting from Westphalian sovereignty to a hidden global architecture of algorithmic control, we have to ask ourselves, are we simply users in a system we can no longer see? It's a provocative question, and one that challenges all of us to critically examine the narratives, the technology, and the underlying architectures of power that shape our daily reality. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.